Story 1. The only show my mom banned my sister and me from watching was Caillou, and this was when we were children. Honestly, good move, Mom. Story 2. The Simpsons was discouraged by the church. I was also banned from reading Harry Potter because my grandfather, a pastor, reported me. Story 3. The Simpsons was a show I had watched for years until my mom decided to be a parent and forbade me from watching it. I ignored her. Story 4. My parents wouldn't let me watch The Price is Right because they clipped coupons. One weekday morning, they walked into the living room just as Bob Barker announced that ham and cheese Hot Pockets cost $2.89. They took the remote from my hands and exclaimed, "We do not bring Hot Pockets into this household unless they're 5 for $10. Story 5. Saturday Night Live was too envelope pushing for my parents' taste in 1975. But I watched it anyway. My parents were always asleep by 11 p.m., so I'd get out of bed and sneak into the den to watch it. Story 6. RuPaul's Drag Race. My mom didn't want me to turn out gay. Well, Mom, it wasn't Drag Race, it was men. Story 7. The Three Stooges. They were afraid I would act like Moe towards my little sister when they weren't looking. I did. Story 8. I was watching HBO at midnight when I was 7 years old. The Shining scarred me. I'm not sure what that says about my parents. Story 9. I was supposed to ban The Simpsons. The church didn't like it, so I watched it with my children. Apart from wondering if there were spy cameras in the house, I couldn't understand why it was banned. Story 10. In living color, I loved it and would secretly sneak and watch anytime I was at a friend's or older cousin's house. Story 11. My brother and I were banned from watching Beavis and Butt-Head because we would walk around the house with shirts stretched over our heads and yell, "Cornholio!" Story 12. Sailor Moon. They thought it was demonic because they saw one monster-looking creature or person. Story 13. The Simpsons. We had just moved into a new house and were all sitting in front of the television. Lots of items were still packed up, so my mom heated some dinners for us. She walked into the room carrying the TV dinners on a tray. A new show had just come on the air. You know, the opening sequence for The Simpsons. It was a mirror image. It was also the first time we had ever seen the show, possibly during its initial airing. My mom entered the room with her tray of dinners for us, all sitting on the couch. She looked at us, then at the television. Marge walked into her living room with a tray of dinners. She looked at her family on the couch and then at the television. My mom dropped the tray and ran out of the room, declaring we would never be allowed to watch that devilish show again. Story 14. My mom tried to ban The Simpsons and Married with Children, but I lived with my dad most of the time, so it only worked when I was at her house. Story 15. Family Guy and American Dad are my comfort shows. I always put them on for background noise. Story 16. Teletubbies. My mother's friend said she didn't allow it in her household because it had elements she considered inappropriate. I honestly don't know if that's true, but I remember my mother mentioning it some time ago. She has changed a lot since then. Story 17. Game of Thrones. My mom took one look at Daenerys and Khal Drogo scenes and decided that 8-year-old me was better off watching SpongeBob instead. Story 18. My parents should have forbidden us to watch the original Exorcist in Salem's Lot, but they didn't. Now I am afraid of the dark. Story 19. Sanford and Son and All in the Family are too controversial. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson is too late and too inappropriate. Story 20. Nothing really. Forbidding something only makes you want to watch it more. If anything, they sat down and watched whatever forbidden show the kids were talking about and watched it with me, asking questions and making jokes about it. Having my mom bring up that Beavis and Butt-Head are somewhat funny but not really, while ruining the cool music videos kind of killed it for me. Story 21. The Simpsons. My mom found it offensive and didn't want me to pick up on rude phrases like, "eat my shorts," and similar expressions. Story 22. Roseanne and The Simpsons. My mom banned them because she didn't like the way the kids disrespected their parents. That being said, she doesn't understand a lot of humor. Story 23. Not me, but my kids. Their dad dislikes SpongeBob with a passion, and it is forbidden in his house, along with many other regular cartoons, because he believes it has hidden adult jokes throughout the show. This is ironic since he allows them to watch South Park, Family Guy, or Rick and Morty. Story 24. Wow! I watched everything growing up, even rated R movies, but they made me close my eyes during love scenes. Story 25. My dad was not a fan of "You can't do that" on television. I watched it on the upstairs television when he went downstairs to watch hockey. Story 26. My mom let us watch pretty much anything we wanted, except Married with Children. She thought it was sexist and degrading to women. Story 27. I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s in a working household. I had no restrictions on my TV usage, as my parents were often not around to monitor it due to work. Story 28. Benny Hill in the 1980s. If you don't know about Benny Hill, it's basically men chasing women in bikinis and skirts. My brother and I used to sneak and watch our parents watching the show and stifle our laughs. These days, I pat my brother's bald head like Benny Hill patted the old man's in the show. Story 29. Smurfs, because in Spanish, it was called Blue Devils. We don't even speak Spanish. He-Man, along with anything that might have magic. Story 30. Married with Children. My mom thought it was absolute trash, and if I was caught watching it, I was grounded from television for a week. Story 31. My mom forbade Family Guy and any show of that nature. Some of my favorite memories are of my dad and me sneaking into the living room at 1 a.m. to watch all the Family Guy episodes he secretly recorded for me. Story 32. South Park. My mom was so upset when she found out my older brother would let me watch it while he babysat. Story 33. Anything related to adult comedy. Whenever I could, I would watch Family Guy or Impractical Jokers, but I always got caught. Story 34. Three Stooges. I am the middle boy. Mom was tired of our nonsense. She was cool with us watching World Wrestling Federation, though. Story 35. Maude and Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. Maude was too mature, and the latter was considered too provocative. Story 36. None. Really? But a friend told me that his religious parents wouldn't let him or his brother watch The Smurfs because of its themes of wizardry and magic. Story 37. All of them. I was raised without television. The only exceptions were Sesame Street and Saturday morning cartoons. Story 38. Oh, all kinds of things. Any live-action Disney show. A bunch of Nickelodeon cartoons. Any show with a person of color as the lead character, except for Static Shock for some reason. Pokemon because it was Japanese. Zoe 101 because Jamie Lynn Spears would corrupt me. No, they weren't super religious. Just strange. Story 39. Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. My mom is Christian, but I had my own TV in my room. I locked the door. Story 40. Dark Shadows. My mother wouldn't let us watch soap operas, especially this one. I had to sneak over to my best friend's house to watch it. Story 41. They knew that if they forbade me from watching something, it would spark an unquenchable desire within me to view it, and I would find a way. Story 42. I was not allowed to watch Sesame Street. I was never told why, but I suspect it was because there were black people on it. My stepdad was racist. Story 43. Small town Arkansas in the 1990s. MTV was blocked by our cable provider because of Beavis and Butthead. Anyway, I watched it at a friend's house with satellite. I thought it was terrible. Story 44. Absolutely none. But in the 1960s and early 1970s, there wasn't a lot of television to be concerned about anyway. Story 45. Laugh-In, a 60s comedy at its finest, was simply hilarious. My husband and I let our oldest child watch an episode last year, and we understood why we were not allowed to watch it at the time. Story 46. The Smurfs. My mom believed the rumor that Papa Smurf read from some demonic Bible or something. It was weird, but I never missed it, anyway. Later on, they let us watch The Simpsons, then the original iterations of Futurama and Family Guy. When the South Park movie came out, my mom watched it with my sibling and me, and we all died of laughter. My dad came in at some point and tried to dismiss it or get us to turn it off, but she overrode him, which she hardly ever did, and finished watching with us. I'm glad she lightened up later on. My dad also watched Dogma with me when it first came out, and we loved it, so it's not like he was some grand decider of appropriateness. Clearly, neither of them were uncomfortable with the idea of blasphemy or curse words. But the Smurfs? Pure, unadulterated evil. Story 47. My parents let me watch whatever they were watching. The only exception was if there was nudity or sex. I had to hide my head under a blanket or behind a pillow until the scene was over. The only thing I remember having to do that for was James Bond. But I'm sure there were more. Story 48. The common theme here is religion. Unsurprisingly, I wasn't allowed to watch my so-called life because my parents thought it would corrupt me. Story 49. Anything from Disney that was live action or about high school made me feel disrespected. I also disliked anything resembling anime due to the art style, and most Cartoon Network shows felt too mature for my taste. Story 50. Back in the 1970s, my parents banned Popeye cartoons for being too violent, as well as most monster movies like Godzilla, werewolves, and vampires from the 1950s. Their most disliked show was Speed Racer. If I watched Popeye at my cousin's house, I wouldn't get in trouble. However, if I watched Speed Racer, there would be significant consequences. Story 51. Three's Company. My dad would often berate us if we were caught watching it and shut it off, saying that it was too stupid. Not for me, I would retort. Story 52. Back when I was growing up, a local station in Toronto aired Baby Blue movies every Friday night after prime time. It was essentially softcore pornography. My parents were fairly open-minded, but that was when they put their foot down after catching me watching them. Story 53. South Park and Beavis and Butthead were considered inappropriate. I still associate negativity or perhaps punishment with them. I never watch. Story 54. Anime, any kind of anime. Pokemon, Sailor Moon, even Hamtaro. At the time, my stepdad considered Pokemon to be evil because it allegedly promoted Satan worship. He believed that since Pokemon is a cartoon from Japan and the Japanese do not adhere to Christianity, all Japanese cartoons were evil and that Japan was trying to influence American youth to worship the devil. As a result, I was allowed to watch South Park, Mad TV, Beavis and Butthead, and The Simpsons, but anime was forbidden. Story 55. Married with Children. I was an 80s baby who spent my formative years in the 90s. We watched The Simpsons together, but as soon as Married with Children came on, the TV was turned off. To this day, I have still never watched it. Story 56. SpongeBob. My mom caught us watching the episode where SpongeBob, or possibly Patrick, used Mermaid Man's belt to mess with Squidward, and it was too graphic and not suitable for our young minds. We continued watching, and eventually, she realized that Squidward was a delicate character who needed protection from the antics of SpongeBob and Patrick, much like Tom needed protection from Jerry. Story 57. Caillou, Rugrats, and Shrek were not allowed because my mom thought they were annoying and didn't want to subject herself to them, which is understandable. Also, Power Rangers for some reason. Story 58. The Simpsons and Family Guy for obvious reasons. Also Pokemon because when my brother played it, our mom would punish him for bad behavior by grounding him from playing, and he would respond by getting physically violent. My mom concluded there was something about the game that made him act out that way, so no more Pokemon in our household. The video game, the cards, and the show were all banned. Story 59. Ed, and Eddie. My mom thought it was too silly. She was right, but that didn't stop me from watching it at the babysitter's. She also thought SpongeBob would be too silly, but my dad watched an episode and loved it. The one time my dad overrides my mom's veto, and now we have lifelong father-son SpongeBob references. Story 60. Rugrats because they thought it was dumb. The X-Files because they thought it was too scary for me. But I feel like they let me watch Alien around the same time, so I don't understand. Story 61. I was banned from watching The Simpsons because they thought the character was too much of a brat and didn't want me to act that way. I snuck and watched an episode one day anyway. I found Bart to be unappealing and did not like the show, so I never watched it again. I was also banned from watching anime, and as a teenager, I was banned from watching cartoons. The ban on anime was because my father firmly believes that it was created by the Japanese to mock Western culture, which is why the characters have exaggerated eyes. The ban on cartoons was because he thought I was too childish. Would he have preferred that I go out drinking and partying like my peers instead of sitting at home in my pajamas watching cartoons? Story 62. The Simpsons, but I could watch horror movies or R-rated movies with no concern. My parents' logic was that Bart Simpson was responsible for me being disrespectful. Story 63. Billy and Mandy. My mom thought it was inappropriate for a children's show, but I was allowed to watch Courage the Cowardly Dog and Flapjack. Story 64. Boy Meets World had college seasons that focused too much on the relationship between Corey and Topanga. In Ed and Eddie, I am not sure why, but I assume there were many adult jokes that I did not understand as a child, though my mom did. I never tried rewatching it to see for myself. Story 65. My mom saw a news report that criticized South Park, and she immediately forbade me from watching it. I still watched it, though. The same thing happened with Grand Theft Auto 3. I continued to play it right in front of her because she couldn't tell the games apart. Story 66. A show? How about a network? MTV, and I don't mean the new MTV with television shows. I mean the classic old MTV, only music videos. My stepdad went as far as to call the cable company to have it completely blocked from our cable box. Story 67. My parents strictly enforced a no Pokemon rule because of concerns about animal cruelty and violence. However, they changed their perspective after watching the episodes where the cruise ship sinks. Story 68. Divorce Court, circa 1969. My mom was a devout Catholic, and divorce was considered a great sin. We were forbidden to watch that show. I sneaked inside one day while she was gardening. I watched the show, and it was boring and lame. I expected something scandalous and lascivious. Story 69. Aside from obvious shows for my age like Family Guy or South Park, I wasn't allowed to watch Arthur and SpongeBob. I haven't seen Arthur because I didn't care by the time I was allowed to watch it. My parents believed the characters were unkind to each other. I was also not permitted to watch SpongeBob because there were supposed inappropriate jokes. Although I haven't seen much of SpongeBob, I doubt that was the case. My mom often mentioned something about SpongeBob contracting a disease from Sandy. However, I was allowed to watch Star Wars, The Clone Wars, Gravity Falls, excluding the episode where Waddles gets smart, and all the classic Looney Tunes, even the banned ones. Story 70. I was once watching Seinfeld, and George was talking about not being able to open a condom. I was probably 11 years old. My mom overheard and immediately turned off the TV and sent me to my room. Story 71. The Smurfs. My mom thought it was satanic and believed the villain's name was Beelzebub. As a kid, I found it eerie, and I still feel that way a little. Story 72. Power Rangers. My mom said it was too violent. It's funny because my parents never really had rules about what we watched. I later found out it was because she thought it was annoying. I just wanted to be the Pink Ranger. Story 73. My dad never cared, and my mom didn't like Married with Children, which is probably why it was my favorite show growing up. Story 74. I am the youngest of 4 children by 8 years, so my parents were pretty much done raising kids. With teenagers in the house, they didn't really restrict anything. However, I banned my children from watching SpongeBob while they were growing up. I cannot stand his laugh. Story 75. Married with Children. My mom didn't think it was appropriate for a young child, which it wasn't, to be fair. I had a TV in my room, so I watched it anyway. Story 76. The Simpsons features Bart, who often provides interesting ideas. Neighbors and Home and Away depict characters living morally questionable lives. Buffy and Supernatural are considered satanic in theme. Story 77. I wasn't really keen on my son watching South Park when he was around 11, but his mom let him watch it at her house, possibly to spite me. However, I watched Ren and Stimpy and Pee-wee's Playhouse with the kids, which were also quite subversive, so I suppose I was being a bit hypocritical. Story 78. Beavis and Butthead. My mom hated it. When she went out of town one time, my dad got Beavis and Butthead Do America at Blockbuster. It was great. Story 79. Not me, but my younger cousins had their parents ban a cartoon on Cartoon Network called My Lab Partner is a Monkey. because the theme song was too annoying. Story 80. My mom told me not to watch Howdy Doody. Growing up, television was pretty mild. One time, I watched a Saturday morning preview show of the new programs coming on that was hosted by Howdy Doody. It was strange because that show was already old before I ever saw any of it. Anyway, my mom wasn't having it. I told her it was just a one-time show and not going to be a regular thing. I couldn't care less, so it was not a bother. I never did ask her why she was against Howdy Doody. Story 81. My parents were convinced that SpongeBob and Patrick were gay, and my mom swore that Patrick was designed to look like a penis to promote the gay agenda. I wish I was making that up. I'm 34 and have never once seen an entire episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. Story 82. My mother didn't forbid me from watching any show, although we often only had a television in the living room and she wouldn't watch Gurren Lagann or Lost. Maybe a few others. We watched 2.5 Men and Community together, so I'm not sure what her deal was. I did have an aunt with whom I stayed for a time, and I couldn't watch anything. I wasn't allowed to watch Pokemon, Power Rangers, The Simpsons, which I sort of get since I was 5, and several other shows. Story 83, Elmo's World. I used to think she had a moral objection that I wasn't aware of. It turned out she just found the voice annoying. Story 84. My grandmother forbade me from watching men's ice skating because she believed it would make me gay. I am a woman and I ended up identifying as queer anyway. Story 85. Avatar, The Last Airbender, because elements are witchcraft. Yu-Gi-Oh! Not exactly sure why. Maybe my mom heard the word summon and thought they were demons. Teletubbies when I was little because of the character associated with a non-straight identity. Pokemon was not allowed for a while due to general Christian fear, but that restriction didn't last too long, thankfully. She didn't like Danny Phantom either because ghosts are demonic. But it wasn't explicitly banned, only discouraged. I actually would have a longer list for movies and books specifically made for kids, a common example being Harry Potter. Story 86. The very first Pokemon, when it came out, was banned by my parents even though I was already a teenager. They believed it stood for pocket monsters, and anything with the word monster meant it was associated with demons in disguise, as their pastor had told them. Story 87. It's not like I had the option to watch what I wanted. I come from a time when one television per household was the norm. I never got to choose what was watched. Story 88. My incubator watched every horror movie under the sun in the 1980s. As a little kid, I was exposed to crazy, horrifying deaths, but if a female nipple appeared in a scene, I had to cover my eyes with the Sunday newspaper TV guide. Story 89. My mom called us in a panic and ordered us not to watch Dark Shadows. We had previously had no interest, but of course, after that call, we tuned in daily. We made a point to zip around and do laundry, vacuum, wash dishes, and start dinner during the commercials. Story 90. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so my mom was always at work or too busy to tell us what to watch. Story 91. Robot Chicken crossed too many lines with excessive swearing. I didn't like it anyway. It creeped me out. I find it amusing that every other Adult Swim program was fine, except for that one. Somewhat like South Park, but only because it annoyed them. Story 92. Cheers, The Simpsons, and Married with Children were noteworthy for their settings in a bar and their portrayal of trash culture. Story 93. Dexter. I think this is self-explanatory. I was a young child when I was told not to go into their room whenever they were watching it, because they said the show was too inappropriate. I always thought they were watching an adult version of Dexter's Laboratory. Boy, was I wrong. Story 94. I grew up mostly in the 1970s. There were a few things some parents might have had an issue with, such as The Night Gallery and Kolchak, The Night Stalker, but nothing that would compare to later decades. Story 95. To this day, if I hear the theme song to Dallas, I might run upstairs to brush my teeth and go to bed. Story 96. I grew up in the 1980s in a very religious home, attending a charismatic church. In this environment, everything was considered demonic, and participation was thought to lead to attacks by demons or possession. Horror movies and secular music, including Michael Jackson, were off-limits. Television shows like Scooby-Doo, were avoided due to their references to ghosts and monsters. Michael Jackson's Thriller, the show Bewitched, and the Smurfs were also not allowed, as characters were associated with demons from the Bible. We could not watch MTV because it was believed to promote a spirit of rebellion and feature inappropriate secular music that discussed sex. I could go on and on. Story 97. Sailor Moon was misunderstood by many who thought it was inappropriate. All the girls at my school had Sailor Moon light-up wands, and I had no idea what they were. Story 98. Beavis and Butthead was something I was told not to watch, yet I would watch World Wrestling Federation during its raunchiest time period from 1999 to 2004. Story 99. I am part of Generation X, born in 1967. I'm not sure if my parents knew that certain movies were options for me. I saw Blazing Saddles in the theater at the age of 8, which reflects the parenting practices of the 1970s. Joking aside, apart from the explicit content accessible on my dad's unscrambled satellite dish, there was nothing I was forbidden to watch. We had access to the satellite dish and channels like HBO, so I genuinely can't think of anything I was restricted from seeing. Story 100. As seems to be much more common than I thought, Beavis and Butthead, The Simpsons. The same reason was given for both. It was disrespectful and inappropriate behavior that they didn't want us imitating. Story 101. The Three Stooges. My brother and I would imitate their slapstick antics with each other, and inevitably one of us would end up hurt and wailing. Our mom was worried one of us would end up truly injured, so no more Three Stooges allowed for us. Yes, I was a child in the 1960s. Story 102. I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, so there was a lot I wasn't allowed to watch. We watched things in secret anyway. Story 103. Ally McBeal. It didn't stop me, though. I don't think I need to explain why. I was too young to watch it. Story 104. My grandparents forbade me from watching Roots. I never learned why. All I ever heard was because I said so. Story 105. Pokemon because it was considered evil. Now my mom knows how silly that was. My 11-year-old is obsessed with it, and my mom has bought her multiple Pokemon items. Story 106. Nothing was on antenna television, so I could watch anything I wanted. We had a horse boarder who would record various shows from cable television for us, including adult films that I guess I was not allowed to watch, but I secretly did. If a regular film had nudity or sexual content, they let me watch it if it was a film I was interested in. I liked fantasy films featuring wizards and warriors, and some of those contained a lot of nudity. One of my favorite films of that genre was Deathstalker. I was allowed to watch Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and The Benny Hill Show. In fact, I saw an actual bare breast very briefly on The Benny Hill Show when it aired on antenna television back in the 1980s in rural Missouri, which felt like sighting a unicorn. Story 107. I tried to watch one episode of Seventh Heaven for Jessica Biel, and my family said it was too sentimental. They are right, and the show is not very good. However, Biel's performance is noteworthy. Story 108. That's So Raven because of magic powers. Fairly Odd Parents because the characters look evil. Rugrats, honestly, I have no idea why. Story 109. A man reading all of these stories finds them quite silly. Why did our parents ban these shows in the first place? I know I won't be banning any shows from my kids if cable television is still a thing in the future. Story 110. SpongeBob, I think it was due to the adult humor. However, my favorite show at 10 was Bones, and my favorite song was As Good As I Once Was by Toby Keith. I believe they didn't actually care, just being performative. Story 111. I was advised not to watch regular show twice. The first time was when a character swore while my mom was nearby, which I can accept as reasonable. The second time was when my dad saw a scene where a group of unicorns was bullying Rigby by farting on him. He pointed it out as bullying, assuming his school-age children wouldn't understand that the characters involved were clearly the antagonists. Story 112. Ren and Stimpy. After what we saw, you know what? I was actually okay with it. The show was just creepy and gross to me. My dad tried to pull the same move with Rocko's Modern Life, but my mom and I both told him to leave that one alone. Story 113. Power Rangers faced criticism when reports surfaced that a child in America died while attempting to replicate the fight scenes, leading to claims that the show was too violent. Story 114, I just want to say, for everyone who says The Simpsons is not worth watching, you were right to watch it anyway. My parents didn't forbid it, we just didn't have cable and only had 6 stations, 4 of which worked at any given time, so I simply didn't watch television. In 2021, I started watching, and suddenly, like 20 years of references and jokes people had been making to me made sense. It was like a bizarre version of not speaking my generation's language. Story 115, Married with Children. Mom didn't like much of it. I discovered reruns on TBS during high school, and I understood why she wouldn't let me watch it. It was hilarious, though. Story 116. The Wiggles drove my mom crazy. She replaced them by recording South Park for my siblings and me to watch instead. She recently said that it probably wasn't the best decision on her part. Story 117. I was a Disney Channel fan growing up, but my mom told me I wasn't allowed to watch Wizards of Waverly Place because of witchcraft. Story 118. I was able to watch it for a few years, but then I was banned from watching 2.5 Men. The show declined immediately after I stopped watching. It's clear why my mom didn't want me to watch it. She believes the mother in the show is unpleasant. Story 119, Ed, and Eddie. I always thought it was because of my name. Now I realize it was because the show was not very good. Story 120. My parents were not too bad, but I remember my mother saying her parents would not let her watch Sabrina the Teenage Witch because they were Christian and very much against witchcraft. Story 121. I liked watching Nickelodeon's Saturday Night Nick, and especially enjoyed the show, Are You Afraid of the Dark? But it came on after Ren and Stimpy. My parents practiced good parenting and watched shows with me when I was a kid. They enjoyed Ren and Stimpy, but knew I wasn't quite old enough to handle its mature content. As a subtle way to keep me from watching it, they bought me a video cassette recorder and taught me how to set it up to record Are You Afraid of the Dark? So I could watch it the next morning and save the video cassettes to watch whenever I wanted while missing episodes of Ren and Stimpy. Story 122. The only television show I can remember disagreeing with my parents about was South Park. However, once my dad actually watched it, he said it was fine and allowed me to watch it. Story 123. All my friends watched it, so I was left out of the conversations. I would try to sneak and watch it, but they watched me closely. Story 124. My mom didn't want me to watch the soap opera because of the character, especially when Billy Crystal starred in a movie at that time as a man who was pregnant. Story 125. Maury and Dr. Phil. She found them both too exploitative and morally bankrupt. Also, she was always confused if I had Frasier on, but that was because I would read during commercials and often couldn't be bothered to find the remote to turn off the TV after whatever I was watching. I think Law and Order had ended and would just be reading. Kelsey Grammer has a very ignorable voice. She didn't ban Frasier, but she wasn't thrilled about me having it on either. I think she just didn't like the show or Grammer, which is very fair. Story 126. Anything that wasn't approved by the church. My dad was in the Mormon church and still is. There has been no contact for years. I specifically remember sneaking out to watch The Simpsons whenever I could. Story 127. One day, my dad came home drunk and berated me, at 7 years old, about learning. He sat me on the couch and played a VHS tape to tell me, "That's what I do to your mom every night, and you need to learn." He passed out drunk after about 30 minutes, and then I went back to playing with my Legos. The porn from the 90s definitely had a distinct style. Story 128. The Three Stooges made us hit each other. I thought, I'll let my boys watch it. I did once, partly because it made them violent, but mostly because it was terrible. Story 129. SpongeBob. I don't know why, but some people thought it would rot your brain and that it contained inappropriate humor. Story 130. No show was really banned in my home. My mom said I couldn't watch Married with Children, but I watched it every week with my dad. Story 131. My parents didn't even allow us to have a television at home. I wasn't allowed to see the movie Titanic or anything rated R. Story 132. Not entirely forbidden, But my mom would remind me when I was watching Power Rangers that only Jesus has real powers. Story 133. My parents would let me watch anything. I was watching South Park in first grade when it came out. They told me not to repeat any of what I watched or heard in school, and it wouldn't be an issue. One day we watched Sam and Cat on Nickelodeon, and they were doing strange things with their feet. I will never forget when my father looked at my mother and said, "Only some dirty pedophiles would think of this garbage." It turns out my dad caught on to this long before everyone else. Story 134. Anything that was on after bedtime was meant for sleeping. They never stopped us from watching shows during the day, so it still surprises me that my Catholic mother let us watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show as much as we did. Story 135. The Simpsons, Home and Away, and Neighbors. My parents thought they were trashy, and they are. However, there was a period of a few years when even my parents got hooked on Home and Away and watched it religiously. Story 136. I got in trouble for swearing in 5th grade and was banned from watching The Simpsons because they thought I learned bad language from it. Story 137. My brother wasn't allowed to watch his favorite show, G.I. Joe, but I was allowed to watch Transformers. He was very upset. Story 138. There was a series in the 1950s and 1960s in the UK called Quatermass, which was reportedly so harrowing that I had to go to bed before it aired. I happened to catch the opening scene of an episode once, and it was very eerie. I would love to see it. The films are as foreboding as the television series. Story 139. They didn't forbid any television show. I was born in 1950, and nothing seemed unfit for child and teen viewing to my parents. Being busy with playing outdoors, school, church, chores, homework, eating meals at the table, going to the movies, the beach, family picnics, playing board games, pleasure reading, and listening to the radio, there wasn't a lot of free time to watch television. We had one television, and most viewing was done as a family. My older brother had time on Saturday afternoons to watch war movies and westerns, which they allowed. Story 140. The Smurfs featured a witch. Ironically, I became interested in Wicca for a while when I got older, but I do not equate Wicca with the character from the Smurfs. Story 141. In the 70s, as a child, I was not allowed to watch Monty Python's Flying Circus, but my best friend at school was allowed to, and he told me about all the crazy and outrageous things he saw. Later, when I was older and got to see reruns, I discovered that all the things he described were made up, and he probably wasn't allowed to watch it either. Story 142. Nothing. If I was watching something inappropriate, they would just say, "What a bad show," laugh, and move on. It's not that serious. I never understood why so many parents forbid their children from watching SpongeBob. A friend of mine said it was because the show used words like dumb, damn, and ass. I never understood that. I always knew what bad words were and recognized when a show was inappropriate, but I never repeated those words or behaviors because I was taught not to. Story 143. All of my parents were evangelical Christians, and television was not considered good. To be fair, there were only 3 channels at the time. Story 144. Beavis and Butthead. I don't understand why that was their limit when we could watch anything else. We also watched it regardless. Story 145. I watched Jaws at the cinema with my sisters when I was 4. My mother's boyfriend gave us the money so they could have some time alone. Story 146. I wasn't allowed to watch cartoons due to violence or I Love Lucy, because my parents thought it was a bad example of marriage. However, many people weren't allowed to watch Married with Children. But I watched that with my parents. They appreciated how the family always stood up for each other. They might tease and be sarcastic, but no one else messes with their family. Story 147. My dad banned SpongeBob for a while because of the scene where Plankton tells the old lady that someone should put her in a box floating down the river. Story 148. Married with Children, Roseanne, and The Simpsons were on our questionable list. However, my mom didn't ban them. She told us we could watch them but had to write an essay about how the family treated each other and why we would or would not want our family to be treated that way. I chose to watch The Simpsons and complete the assigned writing. The first episode one watched was when Bart breaks Lisa's Thanksgiving centerpiece and then runs away. He realizes that family is really important and that he needs to do better and apologize. I wrote about that, and the ban on The Simpsons was lifted because it turns out the family actually loves each other and strives to do the right things, even though they mess up a lot. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.